My name is Hannah. I am 28 years old. And that night at my family's grand dinner table, everyone laughed at me. The room sparkled with chandeliers, wine glasses chimed, and designer suits brushed against imported marble. My cousins bragged about their Ferraris, Bentleys, and Mediterranean villas. Then came the question that always sliced the air like a knife. So Hannah, still taking the bus. Blake smirked, his voice loud enough for every fork to pause. A ripple of laughter spread. My mother shifted uncomfortably. My aunt hid a smile behind her champagne glass. To them, I was the poor relative, the one who chose public transport over luxury cars, jeans over Chanel, a small city apartment over sprawling estates. They thought I was invisible in their world of status symbols. But then, my father's eyes locked on my wrist. That watch, the one I wore almost absent-mindedly. His expression changed, instantly disbelief, then recognition, then something deeper. The kind of silence that rolls across a crowded room when the script everyone expects suddenly tears apart. For years I had tolerated these family dinners, the subtle digs, the overt comparisons, the smug belief that material wealth equaled human worth. But that night the air shifted in ways none of us could have predicted. And it all began with a timepiece. Not just any timepiece, but one that carried the legacy of a man who shaped my destiny. A watch that was never meant to flaunt wealth, but to remind me of who I was when the world tried to tell me otherwise. I can still feel the weight of it against my skin, heavy not with diamonds, but with history, mentorship, and sacrifice. And in that instant, as my father leaned forward with stunned recognition, I knew the narrative was about to flip. The laughter at the table faltered, glasses froze midway, eyes darted between my wrist and my father's face. They could not read his silence, but I could. He knew. And in knowing, he forced everyone else to reconsider everything they believed about me. That night became the turning point, the moment when the labels they had pinned on me no longer fit, when the hierarchy of our family crumbled under the weight of a story they had never bothered to ask about. A story I am about to share with you. Because wealth is not always visible, power is not always loud, and sometimes the quietest details carry the sharpest revelations. Stay with me, because what happened after my father's question changed. Not only the way my family looked at me, but the way they looked at success itself. My father's voice cut through the chatter. His eyes fixed on my wrist carried a weight I had never seen before. And for the first time in years, the entire table fell silent, not because of Blake's mockery, but because of curiosity. You see, silence at my family's dinner table was rare. Normally, it was filled with the hum of competition, new acquisitions, bigger bonuses, luxury homes. That night, however, it felt like a stage where all eyes suddenly turned to me, waiting for something I had not planned to reveal. Blake's smirk faltered, confused by the shift in energy. My aunt whispered something to her husband, her tone hushed. My mother's face stiffened, caught between embarrassment and unease. And my father, the man who had built an empire from nothing, studied my watch with the kind of reverence usually reserved for art hanging in a museum. I adjusted my sleeve, feeling the cool edge of the watch press into my skin. It wasn't diamonds or gold that made it shine. It was what it represented: a gift of faith, a legacy of discipline, a reminder that my worth was never determined by the car I drove or the address on my mailbox. But before I go deeper into what that watch meant, I want to pause. Because right here at this exact moment, I need to ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated because of the way you looked or the choices you made? Maybe someone judged you for not having the right clothes or the right car or the right lifestyle. Maybe they laughed thinking you were less than them. If you have, tell me in the comments. Share your story. Let this space be more than just my voice. I want to hear from you too. And if you've ever felt the sting of being dismissed, hit that subscribe button and stay with me. Because this story is not just about me, it's about everyone who's ever been told they weren't enough. Back at the table, I could feel the tension. My cousins shifted in their chairs. Champagne glasses clinked nervously. The weight of unspoken questions pressed down. "What's so special about that watch?" Blake finally muttered, his tone dripping with forced nonchalance. My father didn't answer him. Instead, he leaned closer to me. "Hannah," he said quietly but firmly, "where did you get this?" I hesitated, not because I didn't want to tell him, but because I knew the ripple it would create. For years, I had chosen silence. I had chosen to let them believe I was the least accomplished, the one who had settled for less. But now, with every gaze on me, I realized that silence was no longer an option. The truth had to surface. As I looked around that long mahogany table past the crystal chandeliers and the silver cutlery polished to perfection, I felt a quiet strength rise within me. They thought my simplicity meant weakness. They thought my bus rides meant poverty. They thought my genes meant failure. They were wrong. And in a few moments, they would understand exactly why. That night wasn't just about a watch. It was about revealing a philosophy, one that had built me into who I was, one that had carried me through storms and triumphs, a philosophy that would outlast cars, clothes, or marble floors. So I took a deep breath, met my father's eyes, and prepared to open a door none of them expected me to unlock. Because sometimes the most powerful stories don't start with wealth on display. They start with a single question, a single silence, and a single decision to finally be heard. I was born into privilege, the kind of world most people only see in glossy magazines. Summers in the Hamptons, winters in Aspen, my family's name etched into buildings across Manhattan. From the outside, it looked like the perfect life, polished, enviable, untouchable. But growing up in that world came with invisible chains. My father Thomas had built his fortune from grit and relentless ambition. He was a man who believed in hard work, in deals inked at midnight, in risks that others feared to take. My mother Eleanor came from old money, a dynasty of influence and heritage. Between the two of them, they gave me everything a child could ever want. But with those gifts came expectations. I was expected to shine, to uphold the family name, to continue the legacy carved out long before me. Every private school, every tutor, every opportunity was designed to mold me into a successor worthy of the Hayes lineage. And yet, I felt like a shadow moving through golden halls, watching my cousins revel in wealth without question. Blake, my cousin, loved that world. The cars, the brands, the applause of our relatives whenever he closed another financial deal. He embodied everything my family valued on the surface. He lived for recognition, for the sparkle of status. But me, I craved something different. I wanted to build something that mattered, something that would stand when the champagne flutes were empty and the lights dimmed. I wanted freedom. Even as a teenager, I questioned the quiet arrogance that filled our family dinners. Why was a person's worth measured by the logo on their purse or the horsepower under their hood? Why did achievement always mean acquisition? The more I asked, the more out of place I felt. My parents, to their credit, tried to guide me gently. My father admired determination, even if he didn't understand mine. My mother, though, feared I was throwing away what they had prepared. She whispered warnings about stability, about reputation, about not letting the family down. And here's the truth: those whispers haunted me for years. They made me wonder if I was reckless for wanting to carve my own path. They made me doubt the voice inside me that whispered real success has nothing to do with appearances. Still, I couldn't ignore it. That pull towards something bigger, something more authentic. Which brings me back to you. Have you ever felt trapped by other people's expectations? Maybe your family wanted you to follow a certain career. Maybe friends thought you should act a certain way. Did you ever feel like you had to wear a mask just to fit in? If you have, tell me below. Your story might be the one that gives someone else the courage to step outside the mold. Because that's what I wanted: courage. And it came in an unexpected form, not from my family, but from a decision that would shock every single one of them. You see, when I graduated from Harvard Business School, everyone assumed I would slide neatly into the empire my father had built. A six-figure salary, a corner office, a Porsche by the end of the year. Blake even joked about it at the time. Why struggle when you can succeed effortlessly? But deep down, I knew that wasn't my story. I wanted to prove to myself, not just to them, that I could build something on my own terms, that I didn't need inherited power or a famous last name. I wanted to know the taste of risk, the grind of uncertainty, the fire of failure. Because sometimes the only way to honor the life you've been given is to refuse the script written for you. And so when the offer came from my father's company, Steady, Lucrative, Safe, I shocked them all. I turned it down. I stepped away from everything I had ever known, straight into the unknown. That decision was the crack that began to break the family's image of me. But what they didn't realize was that the crack would soon become a doorway into a story they could never have predicted. The day I turned down my father's offer was the day my family stopped understanding me. It wasn't that they were angry, it was worse. They were bewildered. My father Thomas stared at me across his massive oak desk, the skyline of Manhattan glowing behind him. "Hannah," he said slowly, "people would fight for this. You could be set for life." But I shook my head. I need to build something that's mine. I need to know I can stand on my own. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with a mix of pride and confusion. My father respected courage, but he didn't always know what to do with it when it challenged his plans. "If this is your choice, I won't stop you, but understand. The world outside these walls doesn't play fair." He was right, and yet I couldn't let fear decide my path. My mother reacted differently. She wept. She accused me of wasting my education, of disrespecting the opportunities she had fought to provide. "Why would you make coffee for strangers when you could be running this company?" she asked, her voice sharp with disbelief. I had no answer she would accept, so I stayed silent, letting her disappointment hang heavy in the room. And then there was Blake. He practically laughed in my face. "You're insane," he sneered. "By next year I'll be driving a Ferrari. You'll still be fetching lattes for some nerd who's bankrupt." I smiled faintly, though inside it cut deep. Maybe I told him. But some things are worth more than cars. He looked at me as if I had spoken a foreign language. So, that's how I found myself walking into a crumbling brick building downtown on my first day at a struggling tech startup. No gleaming skyscrapers, no corner office. Just a handful of young, hungry engineers crowded around beat-up desks, their eyes alight with ideas that felt too big for the room we were in. It was messy, chaotic, exhausting, and I loved it. Every morning I rode the bus, blending in with teachers, nurses, construction workers, people who worked because they had to, not because of some legacy to maintain. It grounded me. It reminded me that life was larger than marble floors and gala dinners. At the startup, I learned faster than I ever imagined. I devoured problems. I stayed late, scribbling solutions on whiteboards until my hands cramped. Within 18 months, I rose from entry level to product manager. Not because of my last name, but because I had earned it. And for the first time in my life, I felt alive. Yet, even as I thrived, my family dismissed it all. To them, my choices looked like failure. They couldn't understand why anyone would trade certainty for risk, comfort for struggle. But sometimes you have to lose the approval of others to gain the approval of yourself. I learned to carry that truth with me every day, even when their words cut. Because I knew something they didn't, I wasn't building a resume. I was building a future. Years later, when I walked into that dinner wearing jeans and a simple blouse, those same cousins who had once laughed at my coffee-fetching job still thought of me as the poor one. They didn't realize that every long night at that startup, every ride on that bus, every time I refused to take the easy road, had prepared me for the moment when their laughter would finally shatter. And it all started with that single decision to say no to the empire and yes to myself. It was during those chaotic early years at the startup that I met the man who would change everything for me, Gerald Clean. He wasn't like anyone I had ever encountered in my world of marble floors and glass towers. Gerald was in his 60s, with a kind smile and eyes that seemed to read the truth behind every word you spoke. He had already built and sold 3 unicorn companies, but he didn't carry himself with the arrogance of a billionaire. In fact, if you saw him on the street, you might not notice him at all. He drove a 10-year-old Toyota. He wore the same 3 sweaters on rotation. He lived in a modest home in Palo Alto that he had bought decades earlier. He had no interest in proving his wealth to anyone. At first, I didn't know what to make of him. But then one late night after a grueling product meeting, he caught me scribbling notes alone in the conference room. Instead of lecturing me, he pulled up a chair and asked, "Why are you really here, Hannah?" Not the resume answer, the real one. I hesitated. Then I told him the truth. That I wanted to build something of my own. That I wanted to prove not to my family, but to myself, that success could mean more than the cars you drove or the houses you owned. He nodded slowly, almost like he had been waiting to hear those words. True wealth, he told me, is invisible. The moment you need to show it, you've already lost it. Those words burrowed into my heart like a seed. From that night on, Gerald became more than an advisor. He became my mentor. He showed me how to cut through noise in the tech world, how to pitch ideas without begging, how to survive failure and still rise again. And unlike my father, who had taught me to chase numbers, Gerald taught me to chase meaning. I soaked in his wisdom, every story of his past failures, every reminder that integrity mattered more than applause. He made me believe that the path I had chosen, though hard, was the right one. So, let me pause here, because I want to ask you something. Have you ever had someone believe in you more than you believed in yourself? A teacher, a friend, a mentor who reminded you that you were capable of more than you imagined? If you have, share it in the comments. Let's celebrate those people, the Geralds of our lives. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe and stay with me. Because sometimes hearing someone else's story can be the spark you've been waiting for. With Gerald's guidance, I rose through the ranks quickly, but it wasn't just about my career, it was about my soul. He reminded me that success wasn't about proving my family wrong, it was about proving myself right. 2 years later, when the startup was acquired by a tech giant, I faced a new decision. I could have taken my payout, bought the penthouse, the Porsche, the lifestyle that my cousins had always waved in my face. Instead, I took the money and founded my own company, Klein Dynamics, named in Gerald's honor. He became my first investor, wiring $500,000 without a formal pitch deck, no contract negotiations. Just a handshake and a look in his eyes that said, "I believe in you." The first 2 years nearly broke me. I worked 18-hour days. I lived in a tiny studio. I poured every cent back into the company. There were moments I wanted to quit, moments I thought Blake had been right moments, when the weight of it all made me collapse onto my mattress, wondering if I'd been foolish. But every time doubt whispered, Gerald was there, with takeout boxes and stories about his own failures, with reminders that the hardest roads often lead to the most meaningful destinations. And so I kept going, because when someone places their trust in you with no strings attached, the only way to honor it is to keep walking forward. On my 27th birthday, Gerald showed up at my apartment carrying a small square box. His timing was almost cruel. I had just returned from another brutal day, where investors had turned me down and clients had walked away. My company, Klein Dynamics, felt like it was hanging by a thread. He set the box on my worn-out kitchen table, its surface cluttered with spreadsheets and takeout containers. "Open it," he said, smiling, that calm, almost mischievous smile of his. Inside was a watch. Not flashy, not covered in diamonds. Just simple elegance, the kind of craftsmanship that whispered rather than shouted. I recognized it instantly. I had seen it in old articles, a limited series Gerald himself had designed years before, back when he was still experimenting with ideas outside of tech. "Gerald, I can't," I stammered. "This watch is worth more than my company." He laughed softly. "Right now, perhaps, but not for long." Then he reached across the table, fastened it around my wrist, and said something I will never forget. "Promise me you'll wear it when you need to remember your worth. Not what others think you're worth, but what you know to be true." I looked down at the watch that night and realized it wasn't just a gift. It was a mantle. A reminder that success had nothing to do with applause and everything to do with impact. 3 months later, Gerald was gone. A sudden heart attack took him from the world, and I was left holding not just his watch, but the weight of his legacy. I wore that timepiece every day after, not because of its market value, which was immense, but because it tethered me to the man who had believed in me when I doubted myself most. Every glance at my wrist whispered, "Keep going, keep building, make it matter." That's the thing about objects. Sometimes they're more than metal or leather, sometimes they carry stories. And as I stood at that family dinner years later listening to Blake sneer about my bus rides, that watch wasn't just an accessory. It was armor. It was memory. It was proof that the life I had built didn't need their validation. But they didn't know that yet. They only saw a simple watch peeking from beneath my sleeve. They had no idea what it meant or what it was worth. Gerald had once told me that beautiful things are meant to be used, not locked away. That's why I wore the watch daily, through late-night strategy calls, through exhausting flights to meet clients, through failures and triumphs alike. To me, it wasn't priceless because of collectors or auctions. It was priceless because it represented resilience. And here's where I want to ask you something. Do you have something in your life that seems ordinary to others, but is extraordinary to you? Maybe it's a letter, a photograph, a gift that carries weight only you understand. If you do, tell me in the comments. Because sometimes the objects we treasure reveal more about our values than anything we could say out loud. That night at the table, my father saw the watch. He recognized it instantly. And the atmosphere shifted. Blake thought he had me cornered, mocking me for being frugal, for living small. But in a heartbeat, everything flipped. Because one man's sneer cannot stand against the truth of a story that carries generations. The watch was no longer just on my wrist. It was on display for all of them to see. And with it so was everything I had built, everything they had dismissed. I hadn't planned to reveal any of it, but sometimes the past has its own way of speaking. And that watch, silent though it was, spoke louder than I ever could. Our sasamam sai work shh. When Gerald passed, the silence in my life was deafening. For months I carried his absence like an invisible weight. Every time I looked at that watch, I felt both grief and responsibility. He had given me more than mentorship. He had entrusted me with his philosophy, his belief that true wealth is measured not by possessions, but by the impact we leave behind. In those first months after his death, I nearly quit. Klein Dynamics was still fragile. We had promising technology, but funding was unstable and competition was relentless. Without Gerald's voice guiding me, I felt like a ship tossed into stormy seas. There were nights I sat on the floor of my apartment, head in my hands, whispering into the dark. What would Gerald do? And then I would glance at the watch. Its ticking was steady, unshaken, almost as if it was telling me to get up, to keep moving, to make every second count. So I did. I pushed harder than ever. I built a team who believed in vision over vanity. I worked 18-hour days, pouring every dollar back into growth. Slowly, we began to rise. New clients came. Our reputation grew. The articles started appearing. And for the first time, people were calling us not a risky little startup, but a serious contender. Yet, through all of it, my family remained blind. At dinners, they bragged about Ferraris, villas, and mergers, while I sat quietly listening, choosing not to mention my contracts or investors. They thought silence meant failure. They never asked the right questions. And I never volunteered the answers. Until the night of that dinner. Until the night Blake mocked me one time too many. Until the night my father's eyes landed on the watch and the room's laughter died in its throat. But before I tell you how everything flipped, let me pause and ask you something. Have you ever lost someone who left you more than memories? Someone who gave you a compass for your life? Maybe a grandparent, a teacher, a mentor who shaped who you became? If you have, I'd love to hear how they still guide you today. Leave it in the comments. Your story matters because the legacies of those people live on when we share them. The truth is, Gerald's presence was stronger in his absence than some people's presence ever is in life. Every choice I made for Klein Dynamics carried a piece of his wisdom. Every contract I signed, every client I helped, every young engineer I mentored, all of it felt like honoring the faith he had placed in me. And that's why the watch mattered so much. To my family, it looked like just an accessory. To me, it was Gerald's voice, his steady hand on my shoulder, reminding me that I didn't need their approval. So when Blake asked with that smug grin if I was still taking the bus, I almost laughed. If only he knew. If only he understood that my so-called frugality was a choice, not a chain. That my life was richer, fuller, freer than his, despite all his Ferraris. And he was about to find out. Because one glance from my father had already shifted the energy in that room. The watch had caught his eye. And what followed was a revelation none of them expected. But in that moment before the truth broke open, I sat quietly, fingers brushing the timepiece, thinking of Gerald. Thinking of how one man's belief can ripple far beyond his life. Thinking of how legacies live not in monuments, but in people who choose to carry them forward. The storm at the dinner table was just beginning, but deep down I wasn't afraid anymore. I knew who I was, and I knew Gerald would have told me to let them laugh, because in the end, the truth always speaks louder than ridicule. The dining room at my parents' estate always felt like a theater stage. The ceilings stretched high chandeliers blazed overhead, and the mahogany table gleamed under the weight of polished silver and crystal. But what really filled the room wasn't elegance, it was ego. Every cousin, every aunt, every uncle treated those dinners like competitions. Blake bragged about his new Ferrari parked deliberately at an angle outside so everyone would notice. Amber twirled her wine glass while recounting details about her villa in Capri. Justin flashed his Rolex, under the candlelight timing his gestures, so the diamonds caught the glow. Even Madison scrolled through photos from her Maldives vacation, sliding her phone across the table to make sure no one missed her beachfront suite. I listened quietly, my fork nudging scallops across the plate, Gerald's watch steady on my wrist. To them, wealth was a checklist, the right address, the right brand, the right car. To me, wealth was something invisible, something they would never understand until it stared them in the face. My mother tried to draw me into the performance. "Hannah, darling," she said sweetly, "your cousin Blake just closed a massive account at his firm. Isn't that wonderful?" She always did this, spotlighted their achievements, brushed mine into silence. Blake leaned back, smug. "Yes, junior partner now, youngest in the firm's history." I smiled faintly. "Congratulations." He tilted his glass toward me. "And you still working out of that little office downtown, or is it a co-working space now?" Laughter trickled around the table. My aunt leaned forward with mock concern. "Darling, there's no shame in admitting when it's time to try something else. Your father could always find a place for you at Hayes Development." I felt irritation rise, but forced my face to remain neutral. "That's very kind," I said evenly, "but I'm doing fine." Of course, none of them believed me. They exchanged knowing looks as if my words were simply a mask for failure. The first course faded into the second roasted beet salad, but the tone of the evening only grew sharper. My uncle recited his latest acquisition numbers. My aunt detailed her Hamptons house renovations, complaining about imported marble suppliers. Each story was a flex, each laugh a reminder of their hierarchy. Through it all, I stayed silent, because silence had power too. Yet even in that silence, I was struck by the absurdity. While they glorified image, I thought of the nonprofits using our platform to connect homeless individuals with work opportunities. I thought of the federal contract we had just secured, the one that would save taxpayers billions. And I thought of Gerald, who would have laughed gently at the circus unfolding in that room. Still, Blake couldn't let me disappear into the background. He leaned closer, his voice dripping with condescension. "Tell me, Hannah, how's the entrepreneurial life? Still surviving paycheck to paycheck? Startups do have a 90% failure rate." The table chuckled again. My mother's lips tightened, caught between defending me and avoiding conflict. My father's eyes flicked toward me, unreadable. I met Blake's gaze steady. "We're managing." He smirked, mistaking my calm for defeat. "Well, persistence is important, even if it doesn't lead anywhere." The arrogance was suffocating, but I let it hang. Because I knew something Blake didn't. The very ground beneath his mockery was about to collapse. Why? The night was a performance, and everyone thought they knew the script. Blake would boast. I would shrink. The family would nod, dismiss, and move on. But not this time. Because while they flaunted Ferraris and villas, I carried something far more powerful. Not a possession to flaunt, but a story. And the moment my father's eyes fell on my wrist, the curtain on their performance began to fall. What came next would silence the laughter for good. By the time the main course arrived, the air was thick with arrogance. My cousins compared wine cellars and theater rooms as if they were talking about groceries. Laughter echoed, but it wasn't joy. It was performance, a contest where whoever spent the most won. I stayed quiet, pushing salmon around my plate, Gerald's watch cool against my skin. To me, it wasn't a piece of jewelry. It was armor. Still, Blake couldn't resist his favorite sport humiliating me. He swirled his Bordeaux, dramatically, smirk curving on his lips. "So, Hannah, you came by Uber tonight, right? Still riding the bus every day?" His voice cut across the table, sharp enough to draw every eye. The room fell into a hush, the kind of silence that waits for a punchline. My aunt hid a smile. My uncle raised a brow, already savoring the spectacle. My mother's face burned with embarrassment, her fork pausing midair. Blake leaned back, savoring his moment. "I mean, there's frugality, and then there's unnecessary suffering. Public transportation in New York, unpredictable. Crowded. Not really our kind of thing." A ripple of laughter spread thin but cruel. I could feel it roll across the table like smoke curling around me, pressing me into the role they had written for me long ago. The poor cousin, the odd one out the girl who didn't belong. But something was different this time, because across the table my father wasn't laughing. He wasn't even looking at Blake. His gaze had shifted to my wrist, his expression unreadable, no more than that. Stunned. I followed his eyes instinctively, saw the faint glint of Gerald's watch peeking from beneath my cuff. In that moment, time seemed to slow. Blake thought he had delivered the final blow, but he didn't realize he had just set the stage for something none of them expected. I straightened in my chair, meeting Blake's grin with calm silence. The weight of Gerald's legacy sat steady on my arm. This wasn't just about a watch. It was about everything I had fought for, everything I had built when they thought I was failing. And now, the tables were about to turn. But before I tell you exactly how that moment unfolded, I want to leave you with this. Have you ever had someone underestimate you so badly that you almost wanted to laugh? That sting of being written off only to know deep down you were holding something they could never imagine. Think about that moment. Hold it. Because when the truth finally comes out, the shock in their eyes is worth more than all their condescension combined. If you've been there, share your story in the comments. I want to hear it. And stay with me, because what happened next when my father spoke changed everything. Blake didn't see it yet. He thought the laughter was his victory. He didn't understand that silence sometimes is more powerful than applause. But he was about to learn, because in just a few seconds, my father would break that silence with a question that would flip the room upside down. A question that would expose the truth behind the watch behind me, behind everything they thought they knew. And when it happened, the hierarchy of that family, carefully built on cars, villas, and titles, would collapse in the span of a single breath. My father's fork hovered halfway to his mouth, forgotten. His eyes stayed fixed on my wrist, unblinking, as if he had seen a ghost. Then his voice cut through the table like a blade. "Is that what I think it is?" The laughter died instantly. My uncle froze with his napkin half raised. Amber's champagne glass stopped mid-tilt. Even Blake's smug grin faltered. For the first time all evening, the room shifted away from him toward me. I felt my pulse quicken, the weight of the watch suddenly heavier, its ticking louder, as if Gerald himself had entered the room. Slowly, I extended my wrist across the table. The candlelight flickered against the brushed steel. My father leaned closer, studying it with the intensity of a man uncovering a lost treasure. This is a Gerald Clean original," he whispered, awe thick in his voice. Uncle Richard scoffed. The tech guy. Didn't he dabble in watches before software? My father shot him a look that silenced him immediately. Not dabble, he corrected sharply. He was a horologist first. He handcrafted a small collection before his first company. Only 50 pieces ever made, each one unique. He paused, his eyes lifting to mine. "How did this end up on your wrist, Hannah?" The room was breathless now. Blake shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence slipping. He glanced from me to the watch, back to my father, clearly out of his depth. I took a sip of water, steadying myself. Gerald gave it to me. On my 27th birthday, he was my mentor and my first investor. Gasps circled the table like a wave. My aunt choked on her wine. Madison dropped her fork with a loud clatter. Blake's mouth opened, but no words came. For years they had painted me as the failure, the odd one. And now, in a single sentence, the script unraveled. My father sat back, amazement still etched across his face. "Do you have any idea what this is worth?" I nodded gently. "I know it's valuable, but that's not why I wear it." He turned to the table, his voice firm. "That watch is worth at least $2 million, maybe more, especially now after Clean's passing." Another wave of shock. My mother's eyes widened, torn between pride and disbelief. My Uncle Richard leaned forward, greed flickering in his gaze. Blake tried to recover, forcing a laugh. "Well, I didn't realize you and Clean were close. He was a legend in the industry." "He was more than that," I said quietly. "He was a friend. He believed in me when few others did." The silence that followed wasn't mocking this time. It was heavy, respectful, edged with curiosity. The power in the room had shifted, and they knew it. "So, let me pause here. Have you ever had an ordinary object suddenly reveal itself as extraordinary?" Something you wore carried or kept, and one day others realized it meant more than they thought? Tell me in the comments. Because sometimes the things we dismiss as simple are the ones carrying the greatest weight. So, as the murmurs spread, I felt the old family hierarchy cracking. For once, Blake had no clever remark. My uncle's smug smile had disappeared. Even my mother looked at me differently. The watch had spoken for me, and with it Gerald's voice had entered that room, silencing arrogance, cutting through vanity, forcing every one of them to reconsider who they thought I was. The dinner was no longer about Ferraris or villas. It was about me. And for the first time, I was ready to let them see the truth. All eyes locked on me, the weight of the moment pressing like stone against my chest. Blake's smirk had evaporated. My uncle's cocktail glass trembled slightly in his hand. Even Amber, usually too tipsy to care about anything, leaned forward, her eyes wide. I cleared my throat. Gerald gave it to me because he believed in what I was building. He invested in my company before anyone else would. Not because of my last name, not because of my family, but because he saw something in me. My Uncle Richard scoffed, but it lacked conviction. Invested? How much? $500,000, I replied without hesitation, on a handshake. A murmur rippled through the room. My mother inhaled sharply, her jeweled hand flying to her chest. Blake's jaw twitched. He had never imagined me capable of commanding that kind of faith, that kind of trust. I went on, my voice steady. He told me once that he wasn't investing in my idea, he was investing in me. Because he saw resilience, integrity, and a vision worth fighting for. That watch was his way of reminding me that worth is not measured in possessions, it's measured in impact. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the clink of silverware as a staff member quietly cleared plates, glancing curiously at the scene unfolding. Finally, my father broke the silence. His eyes gleamed with something I rarely saw in him: pride. Gerald Clean chose his protégés very carefully. If he gave you that watch, it means he considered you family. The table shifted again. Suddenly, I wasn't the outsider anymore. I was the woman holding a legacy none of them could buy, no matter how many cars they parked in the driveway. Blake, scrambling to regain control, forced a smile. Well, I suppose that explains the watch, but a mentorship and a little seed money doesn't mean much in the long run, does it? His tone was mocking, but his eyes betrayed something else: fear. Fear that the ground beneath him was cracking. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands calmly in my lap. No, Blake. It doesn't mean much unless you build on it, and I did. Their gazes snapped back to me, curiosity sharpened now into hunger. For years they hadn't cared about my work, but the moment my watch proved valuable, suddenly my story mattered. I almost laughed at the irony. But let me pause. Have you ever had someone dismiss your accomplishments only to suddenly care when money or status entered the picture? It's a bitter kind of validation, isn't it? Share your thoughts below, because stories like these remind us just how warped society's idea of success can be. Back at the table, I let the silence linger before I spoke again. My voice was measured, deliberate. Gerald was the first to believe in me. He wasn't the last. Since then, my company has grown, quietly, steadily. While you've all been measuring success by cars and vacations, I've been building something that lasts. My uncle's glass hit the table harder than intended. And what exactly have you built, Hannah? I met his stare evenly. Cleany Dynamics. A platform now serving Fortune 500 companies, major healthcare systems, and as of last month, the federal government. The impact landed like a thunderclap. My mother gasped aloud. Blake blinked furiously, his composure unraveling. Madison clutched her phone as if Googling could undo my words. The watch on my wrist ticked steadily, a reminder that Gerald's faith had never been misplaced. And now, in front of the very people who had underestimated me all my life, I had proven it. The twist had landed, the balance had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same again. The room was still vibrating from my words when Blake leaned forward, his composure cracking. The federal government, he repeated, disbelief dripping from every syllable. Yes, I said simply. The contract was finalized last month. We'll be implementing our platform across multiple agencies over the next year. Uncle Richard squinted, skeptical. And how large is this deal? I held his gaze without flinching. 900 million, over 5 years. The silence that followed was almost theatrical. Forks clattered onto plates. My Aunt Pamela coughed on her wine. Madison's eyes went wide as she furiously typed on her phone, desperate to confirm what she had just heard. Blake sat frozen, the color draining from his face. My father broke the silence first. His voice was low, reverent. 900 million. He leaned back almost in awe. That makes it the largest deal announced in our family's history, and it belongs to you. The words stunned me almost as much as they stunned the others. My father, a man who had spent his entire life at the top of the hierarchy, acknowledging that I had surpassed them all. Blake tried to recover his laugh brittle. Well, paper valuations don't mean much, do they? Companies rise and fall overnight. I smiled calmly. Perhaps. But Klein Dynamics isn't just surviving, we're thriving. Our valuation is 1.8 billion. I still hold majority ownership. Gasps echoed around the table again. My mother whispered almost to herself, "You're a billionaire." On paper, I clarified, but that isn't the point. My life is full because of what we build, not what we flaunt. The old narrative, the poor cousin who took the bus, was crumbling in real time. And in its place, a new story was emerging, one they could neither dismiss nor ignore. But before I continue, I want to pause here. Because what came next at that dinner wasn't just numbers on a page. It was something far more powerful, and it carried a lesson I believe we all need to hear. Have you ever noticed how quickly people's tone changes when they realize you're more successful than they thought? Maybe they once mocked you, but then suddenly wanted to associate with you. If you've experienced that, leave a comment. Let's talk about how fragile respect can be when it's built only on appearances. And stay with me, because in just a moment, I'll reveal the truth that shattered their obsession with status and turned the entire family dynamic upside down. Back at the table, I could see their worldviews fracturing. My Uncle Richard, who had married into wealth and parlayed it into status, now stared at me with grudging curiosity. My Aunt Pamela's condescension dissolved into nervous questions. Madison, still scrolling furiously on her phone, finally blurted, "It's true. Forbes is projecting Klein Dynamics to hit $3 billion valuation next quarter." That announcement rippled through the table like an earthquake. For the first time, I wasn't the quiet one on the sidelines. I was the center, and not because of a flashy car or designer jewelry, but because of substance. I touched the watch on my wrist gently, letting my fingers rest against its cool surface. Gerald's words echoed in my mind. The moment you feel the need to prove your worth to others is the moment you've forgotten what you're truly worth. And as my family stared at me, their entire perception shattered. I realized this was the moment to live that truth. Not to gloat, not to boast, but to remind them and myself what success truly means. The next words I spoke would change everything. I let the silence linger, tasting the tension like iron in the air. For years, this family had measured me against the wrong yardstick. Tonight, that yardstick snapped in half. My Uncle Richard finally broke it. "So, Hannah, why keep it all secret? You could be living in a penthouse, driving Lamborghinis. Why hide?" I set my fork down and looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. Because true success isn't about impressing you. It's not about showing off. It's about the impact you create. Gerald taught me that. Blake scoffed. "Easy to say when you have billions." "Actually," I said, my voice steady, "it's harder. Because when you have everything, it's tempting to drown in excess." Gerald refused to. He lived in the same modest house for 30 years. He rode the bus. He gave most of his fortune to education foundations. That's what made him extraordinary. My father leaned forward, nodding slowly. "And that philosophy, it's yours now, isn't it?" "Yes," I said. "That's why I still live in my one-bedroom apartment. Why I ride the bus? Why I pour money into scholarships instead of cars? Because the people we help, the students, the small businesses, the communities, they are my proof of success. Not what's parked in my driveway." The room fell silent again, not mocking, not dismissive, reflective. For the first time in years, I could see cracks in their carefully constructed armor of status. Amber tilted her head, her voice almost childlike. "But doesn't it feel good to show people what you've achieved?" "It feels better," I replied, "to know I don't need to." I could feel Gerald's watch against my skin, its ticking like a heartbeat, reminding me I wasn't here to win an argument. I was here to tell the truth. And that's where I want to bring you in. What do you think success really means? Is it money recognition or the quiet knowledge that you've made a difference? Drop your thoughts below because your definition might inspire someone else who's struggling with that very question tonight. And if this story resonates with you, subscribe. Join this community where we measure value by meaning, not by marble countertops. This isn't just my story, it's ours. At the table, my father's gaze lingered on me, pride softening his features. My mother looked torn, still craving the glitter of appearances, but realizing perhaps for the first time that there was another way to live. Blake, though humbled, leaned toward me. So your company, it's really worth almost $2 billion. Closer to 3, I said quietly, but numbers aren't the point. The point is, what we build lasts longer than cars or vacation homes. The weight of that truth settled over the table like a storm cloud breaking. For once, no one had a comeback, no witty retort, no mocking laugh. The watch ticked on, and I knew whether they admitted it or not, the way they saw me would never be the same. As dessert plates were cleared and coffee was poured, the atmosphere at the table was no longer the same. The arrogance had thinned, replaced by something new. Curiosity, unease, even respect. I had spent years being invisible in this room, but now every glance, every whisper, seemed to circle back to me. My father leaned toward me, his voice low but firm. I've kept an eye on your filings, Hannah. I knew you were doing well, but I didn't realize this. His eyes flicked to the watch, then back to me. You've built something remarkable. It startled me, not just his words, but the sincerity behind them. For the first time, he wasn't seeing me as his little girl needing protection or as the rebellious daughter who walked away from comfort. He was seeing me as his equal. Across the table, Uncle Richard was unusually quiet. His eyes, normally gleaming with condescension, now studied me with something closer to calculation. Aunt Pamela leaned in, her tone suddenly gentle. Tell us more about your foundation, dear. I had no idea you were doing charity work at that scale. For years she had dismissed me. Now she wanted details. I smiled politely. The Klein Foundation for Technological Equity. We provide scholarships, mentorships, and internships for students from under-resourced communities. Our first 50 students are halfway through the program. The 10-year plan is to reach 10,000 students annually. Gasps, wide eyes. Even my mother, who had often begged me to trade jeans for Chanel, sat blinking in silence. My father nodded slowly, almost to himself. That is a legacy, he said. Blake shifted uncomfortably. He had spent the evening bragging about horsepower and bonuses, and now he was sitting across from someone whose idea of wealth was changing lives. His face reddened. Finally, he leaned closer. I owe you an apology, he muttered, voice just loud enough for me to hear. I've treated you like you were beneath me when the truth is... He trailed off, unable to finish. I studied him for a moment. Success means different things, Blake. You've chosen yours, I've chosen mine. All I ever wanted was the courtesy of respect. He nodded, chastened. For once he didn't argue. My father's gaze lingered on me, a mixture of pride and regret. I should have seen it sooner. You remind me of myself when I was younger, hungry to build something meaningful. Only you've gone further than I ever imagined. I touched Gerald's watch, feeling the cool weight against my wrist. He believed in me when almost no one did. I carry that with me every day. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't heavy with mockery. It was filled with thought, reflection, maybe even the first flickers of change. What? Because here's the truth I want to share with you. Sometimes the people closest to us don't see who we are until the world forces them to. And sometimes we have to stand our ground long enough for them to finally notice. If you've lived that, if you've waited for recognition from those who doubted you, leave your story in the comments. Someone out there needs to hear it. That night, as we moved into the library for after-dinner drinks, I realized something extraordinary had happened. The hierarchy of that family, the one that had always placed me at the bottom, had shifted. Not because of a car or a dress, but because of truth. And in the quiet of that shift, I felt something even more valuable than their approval. I felt free. The library had always been my father's sanctuary, shelves, stretching floor to ceiling, leather armchairs worn from decades of conversations, the faint scent of old books and oak. That night, though, it felt different. The family drifted in clusters, hushed now, no longer competing for attention. And everywhere I turned, eyes sought me out, curious, humbled, even admiring. I slipped into a quiet corner with a glass of whiskey, needing a moment to breathe. For years I had been invisible here. Tonight the balance of power had shifted, and the weight of their stares felt as heavy as the silence. My father joined me, settling into the chair beside mine. Quite a performance, he said, not unkindly. I shook my head. I wasn't performing. I was just telling the truth. He studied me, his expression thoughtful. And the truth is more powerful than any display of wealth. I wish I had understood Gerald better. He clearly saw something in you, something I should have recognized sooner. I touched the watch gently. He invested in me before anyone else would. Not because of profit, but because he believed in building things that mattered. My father nodded slowly. And you've honored that belief. Hannah, you've built more than a company. You've built a legacy. His words hit deeper than I expected. For so long I had craved his respect without realizing it. Now, sitting in the quiet of that library, I felt it fully for the first time. Blake approached hesitant, his arrogance stripped away. He shifted awkwardly before speaking. I wanted to apologize again. For all the years I mocked you. For assuming your choices meant failure. I looked him in the eye. And if my company was worth nothing, would you still apologize? He flushed, then lowered his gaze. I hope I would. You're right. I've been measuring success by the wrong things. He hesitated, then added, I'd like to learn. About Gerald. About your philosophy. I considered him for a long moment. Then I nodded. If you're willing to listen, I'm willing to share. By the end of the evening, something subtle but undeniable had changed. My cousins no longer boasted quite as loudly. My aunts and uncles asked questions instead of delivering condescension. And my father, for the first time in my adult life, looked at me not as a daughter who strayed, but as a woman who had carved her own place in the world. That night, as I rode the subway back to my apartment, I looked around at the strangers sitting beside me, a construction worker, a nurse, a student, nodding off with textbooks on her lap. To anyone else, I was just another passenger. No one knew I had signed a $900 million contract. No one cared that my company was valued at nearly $3 billion. And that was exactly how I liked it. Because Gerald was right, true, wealth is invisible. It's not the watch on your wrist, the car in your driveway, or the villa on your Instagram feed. It's the impact you leave behind. It's the students lifted, the small businesses saved, the lives made better. That is success. So here's my question for you. What's your definition of success? Is it the applause of others, or the quiet certainty that you've built something meaningful? Leave your answer in the comments. I want this community to be a place where we redefine wealth together. And if you're ready for more stories that challenge the way we see power, purpose, and freedom, hit subscribe. 'Cause the story doesn't end here. In fact, in my next video, I'll take you inside the first project of our foundation, where a 16-year-old student shocked me with an idea that could change how America fights food insecurity. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happened next. Atsainta kambaing. When I finally closed my apartment door that night, the city lights flickering through the window, I slipped the watch from my wrist and held it in my palm. For a long moment, I just stared at it, the weight familiar yet new. To my family, it had been a revelation proof of hidden worth, a priceless artifact that shifted everything they thought they knew about me. But to me, it was still what it had always been, a compass, a reminder, a connection to the man who believed in me when I had nothing but grit and a fragile dream. I thought back to Gerald's words. The moment you feel the need to prove your worth to others is the moment you've forgotten what you're truly worth. At that dinner, I hadn't tried to prove anything. The truth had revealed itself naturally, as it always does when we live authentically. And maybe that was the greatest lesson of all. That we don't need to chase recognition. That real power isn't in convincing others, it's in knowing ourselves. The family dinner hadn't changed who I was. It hadn't made me stronger or more successful. What it had done was strip away the illusions of status, the fragile masks my relatives wore so tightly. And in their silence, I saw something rare, the first spark of understanding. As I placed the watch gently on my nightstand, I smiled. Tomorrow would bring another battle, new clients, new challenges, new doubts. But tonight I felt at peace. Because I knew my worth, not in numbers, not in applause, but in the quiet certainty that I was living true to the values that mattered. And that far more than wealth was freedom.